Eleanor Whitmore's hands were shaking so badly that the maid had to tie the ribbon at her back 3 times before it held. Outside the window, carriages were already lining the gravel path, and somewhere below, her father was laughing with a man twice her age, a man she was about to marry in less than an hour. She did not love him. She did not even know him. All she knew was that her father owed a debt so large, it threatened to take their house, their land, and their name, and that the Duke of Ashcombe had offered to erase every shilling of it in exchange for a wife. "You look pale," the maid said gently, smoothing the last fold of white silk. "Shall I fetch you some water?" Eleanor shook her head. Water would not fix this. Nothing would fix this. She was 20 years old, and in less than an hour she would belong to a stranger for the rest of her life. She thought of running. She had thought of it every day since the arrangement was announced, imagining herself climbing out the back window and disappearing into the countryside, never to be found. But she knew what would happen if she did. Her father would lose everything, and her mother, already frail with worry, would not survive the shame. So she stayed, and she let the maid finish dressing her, and she walked down the stairs when it was time, because there was no other choice left to make. The chapel was small and cold despite the number of candles burning along the walls. Eleanor walked the aisle on her father's arm, her eyes fixed on the flagstones so she would not have to look at the guests whispering behind gloved hands. When she finally lifted her gaze, she saw him for the first time up close. Gareth Ashcombe stood at the altar in a dark coat, tall and broad-shouldered, his face lined in a way that spoke of years she had not lived. His hair was more gray than not. His expression gave away nothing at all. He did not smile when she reached him. He did not frown either. He simply looked at her the way a man might look at a document he was about to sign, with quiet, careful attention and no warmth whatsoever. The priest spoke words that Eleanor barely heard. She answered when she was told to answer. She let the ring slide onto her finger, cold and heavy, and she felt the whole of her old life close like a door behind her. When it was over, there was no celebration worth the name. A short reception was held in the manor's drawing room, filled with guests who cared more about the Duke's fortune than about the girl he had married. Eleanor stood beside her new husband for nearly 2 hours, accepting congratulations that felt more like condolences, until at last the guests began to leave and the house grew quiet. It was then, as the last carriage rolled away down the drive, that Gareth turned to her for the first time since the ceremony and spoke directly to her. "Come to the study before you retire," he said. "There is something I need to give you." His voice was low, even, difficult to read. Eleanor nodded because she did not know what else to do, and watched him walk away without waiting for a response. She used the hour before that meeting to explore her new surroundings, though exploring was perhaps too generous a word for the nervous, careful steps she took through the long corridors of Ashcombe Hall. The house was grand in a way that felt more like a museum than a home, filled with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her, and rooms so large her footsteps echoed against the marble floors. A young housekeeper named Margaret found her wandering near the east wing and offered to show her the way back toward the family quarters. Margaret was kind, if a little guarded, and Eleanor found herself grateful for a single friendly face in a house full of strangers. "Is he always so quiet?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. Margaret hesitated, glancing down the hallway as though the walls themselves might be listening. "He was not always like this, my lady. Not before." "Before what?" But Margaret only shook her head and said it was not her place to speak of such things, and led Eleanor the rest of the way in silence. They passed a long gallery of family portraits before reaching the family quarters, and Eleanor slowed her steps to look at them. Most were stern-faced men in old military coats, their painted eyes cold and distant. But near the end of the gallery hung a portrait unlike the others, a woman with soft brown hair and a gentle smile, painted in colors far warmer than the rest. "Who is that?" Eleanor asked, though some instinct told her she already knew the answer before Margaret spoke. "The first Duchess, my lady," Margaret said quietly. "Lady Charlotte. She passed some years ago now." "How did she die?" Margaret's expression tightened, just slightly, the way a person's face changes when they are choosing their words with great care. "It was a fever, my lady, very sudden. The whole house grieved for a long time after." There was something in the way Margaret said it, a hesitation that lingered a beat too long, that made Eleanor's skin prickle. She looked back at the portrait once more before they continued walking, memorizing the soft brown eyes of a woman she would never meet, wondering why her presence still seemed to hang so heavily over every corner of this house. They reached the family quarters a few minutes later, and Margaret pointed her toward the study before excusing herself with a small, respectful bow. Eleanor stood alone in the corridor for a moment, gathering her courage, before she pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside to meet her husband for what felt like the first real conversation of her new life. The study, when Eleanor finally found it, was a warm room lined with books from floor to ceiling, a fire already crackling in the hearth despite the mild evening. Gareth stood near the window with his back to the door, a small wooden box resting on the desk beside him. "Sit if you like," he said without turning around. Eleanor remained standing. She had spent the whole day doing as she was told, and some small, stubborn part of her needed to choose something for herself, even if it was only where to stand. Gareth finally turned to face her. For a long moment he studied her, the same careful attention he had shown at the altar, and then he crossed the room and picked up the box. "This is yours," he said, holding it out. "Open it when you are alone. Not tonight. If you would rather wait. There is no urgency." Eleanor took the box. It was heavier than it looked, the wood dark and polished, with a small brass clasp holding it shut. She looked up at him, searching his face for some explanation, but he offered none. "Why give me something before I have even asked for anything?" she said. The question came out sharper than she intended, but she did not take it back. Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. "Because a bargain should not only favor one side," he said. "Whatever you think of this marriage, and I imagine you think little good of it, I intend to keep my word to you. All of it, not only the parts that were written into the contract." Eleanor did not know how to answer that. She had expected coldness, indifference, perhaps even cruelty from a man who had purchased a wife the way other men purchased land. She had not expected anything that sounded even faintly like a promise. "Good night, Eleanor," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice was strange, unfamiliar, and yet not entirely unwelcome. "Your chambers are through the north corridor. Margaret will show you, if you have not already found your way." He left her alone in the study with the fire crackling, and the box heavy in her hands. She stood there for a long while after he had gone, staring at the door, trying to understand the man she had just married, and finding that she understood nothing at all. That night, alone in a bedroom larger than her entire home had been, Eleanor sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed with the box in her lap. Her fingers hovered over the brass clasp. Margaret's warning echoed in her mind. "He was not always like this, my lady." Not before. Before what, she wondered. Before his first wife died? Before something else entirely? She thought of opening the box right then, of finally learning what secret her new husband had chosen to hand her on the very night of their wedding. But something held her back, a quiet feeling that once she opened it, there would be no returning to the person she had been that morning, the girl who still believed, in some small corner of her heart, that this marriage might simply be endured and then forgotten, like a difficult winter that eventually passed. She thought of her mother, likely still awake in the small house across the county, worrying over her daughter the way she had worried over everything for as long as Eleanor could remember. She thought of her father, who had not met her eyes once during the entire ceremony, too ashamed, perhaps, of what his debts had cost her. And she thought of the life she had imagined for herself before all of this began, a life with choices in it, however small, a life that now felt as distant as the portraits hanging in the gallery downstairs. Exhaustion, grief, and the sheer weight of the day pressed down on her until she could no longer keep her eyes open, and she set the box on the table beside the bed, unopened, and let sleep take her before she was ready to face whatever truth waited inside. Outside her window, the moon rose over Ashcombe Hall, casting long silver light across the gardens below. Somewhere in the house, footsteps moved quietly through the corridors long after everyone else had gone to sleep, and a single lamp burned in a locked room at the far end of the east wing, though Eleanor did not yet know to wonder why. The box sat unopened on the table for 3 full days before Eleanor found the courage to lift its brass clasp. She had spent those days learning the shape of her new life, the long hallways of Ashcombe Hall, the names of the staff, the strange silence that settled over the house each evening when Gareth disappeared into his study and did not emerge again until well past midnight. She had begun to notice things, the way the servants lowered their voices whenever his name came up, the way no one, not even Margaret, would speak plainly about the first Duchess, the way a single lamp burned every night in a locked room at the far end of the east wing, though no one ever went in or out of it while Eleanor was watching. On the 4th morning, alone in her chambers with pale sunlight spilling through the curtains, she finally opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was a folded document sealed with wax, and beneath it, a smaller envelope with her name written across the front in careful, steady handwriting. She opened the document first, and it took her several minutes of reading before she understood what she was looking at. It was a deed. A full and legal deed to an estate called Thornfield, a modest but comfortable property nearly a day's ride from Ashcombe Hall, transferred entirely into her name. Not shared with her husband, not tied to the marriage in any way that she could see. Hers alone, outright, regardless of what happened between her and Gareth in the years to come. Eleanor read the document 3 times before setting it down with trembling hands. Then she opened the envelope. The letter inside was short, written in the same steady hand as her name on the envelope. Eleanor. Whatever this marriage becomes, you will never be without a place of your own, or the means to support yourself, should you ever need to leave this house and never look back. I ask nothing in return for this. Consider it a promise kept before it was ever demanded of me. Gareth. She read the letter again, and then a 3rd time, trying to find some hidden motive behind the words, some catch or condition she had missed, but there was none. It was, as far as she could tell, exactly what it appeared to be. A safety net, offered freely, by a man who had shown her almost nothing of himself since the day they married. It did not fit the picture she had built of him in her mind. The cold, distant Duke who had purchased a wife the way other men purchased horses, and that unsettled her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she could have understood. Cruelty she could have prepared herself for. This quiet, careful kindness left her with nothing to brace against. She found him that evening in the same study where he had given her the box, seated behind his desk with a stack of papers in front of him, a small lamp casting warm light across his tired face. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted, though she could not name what. "You opened it," he said. "I did." Eleanor stepped further into the room, the deed still folded in her hand. "Why would you give me an entire estate before I have given you anything at all?" Gareth set down his pen slowly, considering the question with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "Because I have seen what happens to women who marry men like me, and are left with nothing when things go wrong. I did not want that to be your fate, whatever else this marriage becomes." "Things go wrong how?" Eleanor pressed. "What happened to your first wife, Gareth?" The room went very still. For a moment, she thought he would not answer at all, that he would retreat behind the same guarded silence she had grown used to since the wedding. But instead, something in his face grew heavier, older, as though the question had reached down and touched something he kept buried most days. "She died," he said simply. 3 years ago. That is all the staff will tell you, and that is all I intend to say tonight. That is not an answer. It is the only one I am prepared to give you right now." His voice was not unkind, but it carried a finality that told Eleanor there would be no pushing him further. Not that evening. "Perhaps in time, Eleanor, when there is trust between us, I will tell you more. But trust is not built in 4 days." She wanted to argue. She wanted to demand the truth right then, standing in his study with the deed still clutched in her hand, proof that this man was capable of a kindness she had not expected, and a secrecy she had not anticipated in equal measure. But something in his eyes stopped her, a weariness so deep it looked almost like grief, and she found she did not have the heart to push any harder that night. Instead, she asked a different question. "Why Thornfield? Why that estate, out of everything you own?" For the first time since she had met him, something close to a real smile touched the corner of his mouth, small and fleeting. "It was my mother's. Before she passed, she loved it more than any other property we hold. I thought, if I were to give you a place of your own, it should be one that was chosen with care, rather than simply the nearest available deed." Eleanor did not know what to say to that. The image of the cold, calculating Duke she had built in her mind over the past 4 days cracked further, revealing glimpses of someone far more complicated underneath. The next morning, Eleanor sought out Margaret in the small sitting room where the housekeeper kept the household accounts, hoping to learn more about the ledgers she had seen and the man who kept them so carefully hidden. "Margaret," she began, choosing her words with care, "has His Grace always kept separate books, apart from the estate accounts?" Margaret's hands paused over the linens she was folding, and for a moment she said nothing at all. "It is not my place to speak of his private affairs, my lady. I am not asking you to betray him," Eleanor said gently. "I only wish to understand my husband a little better. Surely that is not so terrible a thing to want." Something in Eleanor's tone must have softened the housekeeper's resolve, because Margaret set down the linens and glanced toward the door before speaking again, her voice lowered. "There are families in the village, my lady, and further out on the tenant lands, who have received help over the years. Money for a roof repair, a doctor's fee paid quietly, with no name attached. No one is meant to know it comes from him. He would be quite unhappy if he learned I had told you." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. A warmth she had not expected. Why keep such kindness a secret? Margaret hesitated again, then said quietly, "Because, after the first Duchess passed, my lady, there were those in the county who whispered cruel things about him. Things I do not believe were true. I think he decided it was easier to do good quietly than to be doubted loudly." "What sort of cruel things?" But Margaret's face closed again, the way it always did whenever the conversation edged too close to the truth of Lady Charlotte's death. "That is a question for His Grace, my lady, not for me. I have already said more than I should." Eleanor did not push further, sensing that the housekeeper had reached the limit of what loyalty would allow her to share. But the conversation stayed with her for the rest of the day, another small piece added to the puzzle of the man she had married. A man capable of quiet generosity, and yet surrounded by whispers he refused to answer. Over the following days, Eleanor found herself watching Gareth more closely, searching for the man behind the careful, guarded exterior he showed the world. She noticed the way he never raised his voice with the staff, even when mistakes were made. She noticed the way he asked after the health of an elderly groundskeeper by name, remembering details about the man's family that most lords would never bother to learn. She noticed, too, the ledgers. She came upon them by accident one evening, passing his study on her way to the library, the door left slightly ajar. Gareth sat hunched over a set of papers that did not look like the estate accounts she had glimpsed before. These were different, filled with names she did not recognize, sums of money crossed out and rewritten, notes in the margins about debts and payments. She did not mean to linger, but something about his expression, the deep focus, the faint furrow of worry in his brow, held her in place a moment longer than she intended. When a floorboard creaked beneath her feet, he looked up sharply, and for the briefest moment, before he composed himself, she saw something close to alarm in his eyes. "Eleanor," he said, closing the ledger with a decisive motion, "I did not hear you there." "I was not trying to spy," she said quickly, though the truth was somewhere closer to curiosity than she wanted to admit. "What is that?" "Estate business," he said, and the warmth from their earlier conversation had cooled again, replaced by the same careful distance she had grown used to. "Nothing that need concern you." She wanted to press further, but the shift in his tone told her clearly that this door, at least for tonight, was closed. She said good night and left him to his papers, though she carried the image of those unfamiliar ledgers with her long after she had returned to her own chambers. Sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake turning over everything she had learned in the past week, the deed to Thornfield resting in the drawer of her writing desk, the letter tucked safely beside it, the memory of Gareth's face when she had asked about his first wife, the strange ledgers filled with names and sums that did not belong to any estate business she understood. There was a story here, buried beneath the cold reputation and the guarded silences, a story about a man who had lost something once and had spent every day since trying, in quiet and unseen ways, to make sure no one else suffered the way he had. Eleanor did not yet know the shape of that story, but she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wanted very much to learn it. 2 days later, a letter arrived at Ashcombe Hall addressed to the Duke, carried by a rider who refused to wait for a reply, and left as quickly as he had come. Eleanor watched from the window of her chambers as Gareth read the letter in the courtyard below, his shoulders growing tense with every line, his face going pale in a way she had not seen before, not even when she had asked him about his first wife. Whatever the letter contained, it frightened him. Eleanor pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window and watched as he folded the paper with quick, sharp movements and tucked it into his coat, glancing up at the house as though checking whether anyone had seen. She stepped back from the window before their eyes could meet, her heart beating faster than the moment seemed to warrant. She did not see him again until supper, and even then he said almost nothing, answering her questions about the day with short, distracted replies, his attention clearly elsewhere. When she asked, as casually as she could manage, whether the rider that morning had brought bad news, Gareth's fork stilled against his plate for the briefest moment before he answered. "Nothing that concerns you," he said, echoing the same words he had used about the ledgers, and Eleanor understood then that there were entire rooms in this man's life she was not yet permitted to enter, doors that remained locked no matter how gently she knocked. She excused herself early that evening, claiming tiredness she did not entirely feel, and retreated to her chambers to sit by the window and watch the darkness settle over the grounds of Ashcombe Hall. From her window she could see the light still burning in Gareth's study long after the rest of the house had gone quiet, a single glow against the black shape of the manor, steady and unmoving, as though the man behind it did not intend to sleep at all that night. Eleanor thought of the deed to Thornfield resting safely in her writing desk, of the letter that had come with it, of the quiet kindnesses Margaret had described, of the ledgers filled with names she did not recognize, and of the fear she had seen so briefly on her husband's face in the courtyard below. Whatever secrets Gareth Ashcombe carried, she was beginning to understand that they were heavier and more dangerous than she had first believed. And she found, watching that lone light burn through the darkness, that she no longer wished to remain a stranger to whatever truth he was so carefully guarding. A carriage arrived at Ashcombe Hall without warning on a gray afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after Eleanor's wedding, and the moment she saw the crest painted on its door, she felt the household tense around her like a held breath. She asked Margaret, who had appeared at her side in the entrance hall with unusual speed. "Mr. Nathaniel Croft," Margaret said, and there was something careful in the way she said the name, the same caution she used whenever the conversation drew close to Lady Charlotte. "His Grace's cousin, my lady." The man who stepped down from the carriage was younger than Gareth by perhaps 10 years, dressed in fine clothes that seemed almost too fashionable for a country visit, his smile wide and easy in a way that Eleanor instinctively distrusted. He crossed the courtyard with the confident stride of a man who believed himself welcome everywhere he went, and when he caught sight of Eleanor standing in the doorway, his smile widened further. "You must be the new Duchess," he said, bowing low over her hand before she could offer it. "Nathaniel Croft, at your service. I confess I did not expect Gareth to marry again so soon, but I can certainly see why he did." Eleanor withdrew her hand as gracefully as she could manage. "Mr. Croft, I was not told to expect visitors. I rarely announce myself," he said with an easy laugh. "Family should not need an invitation, should they?" Gareth appeared behind her a moment later, drawn by the commotion, and Eleanor watched the warmth drain from his face the instant he recognized his cousin standing in the courtyard. Whatever peace had settled over the household in the past 2 weeks vanished in that single moment. "Nathaniel," Gareth said, his voice flat and careful, "you might have written ahead." "And missed the chance to surprise you?" "Never." Nathaniel's smile did not waver, though Eleanor thought she caught something colder moving behind his eyes. "I heard about the wedding and simply had to come see for myself. Surely you will not turn away family, cousin." There was a tension between the two men that Eleanor could not fully name, something old and unresolved simmering just beneath the surface of their polite exchange. Gareth invited his cousin inside with words that sounded gracious but a tone that carried no warmth whatsoever, and Eleanor found herself watching the two of them with growing unease, as the household staff scrambled to prepare a guest room on short notice. Over the following days, Nathaniel made himself thoroughly at home, appearing at meals uninvited, wandering the grounds as though he owned them, and seeking out Eleanor's company whenever Gareth was occupied elsewhere. He was charming in a way that made her uneasy, rather than comfortable, always quick with a compliment, always steering conversations toward questions about her marriage that felt far too personal for a man she had known less than a week. "How are you finding life as a duchess?" he asked one afternoon, finding her alone in the garden where she had gone to escape the oppressive quiet of the house. "Gareth is not the easiest man to live with, I imagine. He was not always so guarded, you know, not before Charlotte." Eleanor's attention sharpened at the name. "You knew her well?" "Better than most." Nathaniel settled onto the bench beside her without invitation, close enough that Eleanor shifted slightly away. "We were close, Charlotte and I. Her death changed him, made him suspicious of everyone, even the people who loved him most." "How did she die exactly?" Eleanor asked, hoping the directness might catch him off guard the way it had never worked on Gareth. Something flickered across Nathaniel's face, there and gone so quickly, Eleanor almost missed it. "A fever, officially. Though I have my own doubts about that story, if I am honest with you." Gareth was rather cold to her, near the end. Distant. "I have always wondered whether the strain of it hastened whatever illness took her." The implication settled over Eleanor like a shadow, cold and unwelcome. She thought of the man who had given her an entire estate before asking anything of her in return, who spoke quietly of a dead wife with grief still heavy in his voice, who spent his nights bent over ledgers helping tenant families in secret. It did not fit the picture Nathaniel was so carefully painting for her. "That does not sound like the man I have come to know," she said carefully. "People show different faces to different people," Nathaniel said, his voice softening into something almost gentle, almost convincing. "I only tell you this because I would hate to see you hurt, Eleanor. May I call you Eleanor? I feel already that we understand each other." She did not grant him the permission, but he used her name anyway, and something about the easy familiarity of it made her skin crawl. She excused herself soon after, claiming a headache, and retreated to the house with Nathaniel's words circling uncomfortably in her mind. That evening, she found Gareth in his study, as she often did now, and hesitated in the doorway before speaking. "Your cousin says the fever story is not the whole truth," she said finally. "He suggests you were cold to Charlotte near the end. That the coldness may have hastened her death." Gareth's pen stopped moving. He set it down slowly and looked up at her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something close to real anger tighten the lines of his face, though it did not seem directed at her. "My cousin," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "has always had a gift for rearranging the truth to suit his purposes. I would advise you to be cautious of anything he tells you, Eleanor, no matter how convincing it sounds." "Then tell me your version," she said. "You have avoided the question for 2 weeks now. I think I deserve more than silence, especially when your own cousin is filling that silence with suspicion." Gareth was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor thought he might refuse again, retreat behind the same guarded walls he had used every time this subject arose. But instead, he rose from his desk and crossed to the window, staring out at the darkening grounds with his back to her. "Charlotte was unwell for many months before she died," he said finally. "A wasting illness the physicians could never quite name. I was not cold to her. I sat with her every night that I was able, until the end. But Nathaniel was often at the house during those months as well, and there were things about that time that never sat right with me, things I could never prove." "What kind of things?" "Money that moved through the estate accounts in ways I could not explain. Small amounts at first, then larger, always around the times Nathaniel visited. Charlotte grew weaker whenever he stayed longest. I told myself it was coincidence. Grief makes a man doubt his own eyes." He turned back to face her, and the weariness in his expression had deepened into something closer to old, unresolved pain. "After she died, Nathaniel inherited a considerable sum through a clause in her personal will, one I did not know existed until it was read aloud at her funeral. I have never been able to prove anything against him, but I have never trusted him since, and I would ask that you extend him the same caution, whatever charm he shows you." Eleanor absorbed this in silence, weighing his words against the ones Nathaniel had offered her in the garden that afternoon. Two very different stories, and only one of them could be close to the truth. "Why does he keep visiting, if you distrust him so completely?" "Because turning him away outright would only confirm whatever suspicions he wishes to spread about me in society," Gareth said. "It is easier to keep him close and watched than to give him reason to whisper against me from a distance. I know how that sounds, cold, calculating, but I have learned, since Charlotte, that some kindnesses must be practiced quietly, and some threats must be managed carefully, or they grow into something far more dangerous." Eleanor thought of the ledgers she had seen, the quiet payments to tenant families, the estate given to her before she had asked for anything, and found that his explanation, however uncomfortable, fit the man she had begun to understand far better than Nathaniel's easy, practiced charm ever had. "I believe you," she said quietly, and watched something in his shoulders ease, just slightly, as though her words had lifted a weight he had carried alone for a very long time. But belief did not erase the unease that settled over the house in the days that followed. Nathaniel showed no sign of leaving, extending his visit week by week with excuses about the state of the roads or business he claimed to have in the county. Eleanor began to notice small things she had missed before. The way Nathaniel lingered near Gareth's study door when he thought no one was watching. The way he asked the staff pointed questions about the household's finances under the guise of idle conversation. The way his charm sharpened into something colder whenever Gareth was not present in the room. One evening, unable to sleep, Eleanor rose from her bed and made her way toward the library in search of something to read, only to freeze in the corridor when she heard voices coming from the study, the door left slightly ajar. She recognized Nathaniel's voice immediately, low and urgent, though she could not make out every word. "Cannot wait forever," she heard him say. "The longer this drags on, the more difficult it becomes to—" A second voice answered, one she did not recognize, followed by the rustle of paper and the quiet clink of a glass being set down. Eleanor crept closer, her heart pounding, straining to hear more, but the voices dropped too low to follow, and a floorboard creaked beneath her foot before she could learn anything further. The conversation inside the study stopped instantly. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall in the darkness, holding her breath, and a moment later the study door opened fully, spilling lamplight into the corridor. Nathaniel stepped out, his expression composed into its usual easy charm, though Eleanor thought she caught a flicker of something sharper beneath it when his eyes found her standing there. "Eleanor," he said smoothly, "wandering the halls so late?" "I could not sleep," she said, matching his composure as best she could, though her pulse was racing. "Who was that with you?" "A business associate," Nathaniel said easily. Nothing that would interest you, I am sure. He studied her for a moment longer than felt comfortable, and Eleanor had the distinct impression that he was trying to determine exactly how much she had overheard. You should return to bed, Eleanor. These halls grow cold at night, and I would hate for you to catch a chill. She did not miss the faint edge beneath his pleasant tone, something that sounded, if she listened closely enough, almost like a warning. She wished him good night and returned to her chambers, but sleep did not come easily, her mind turning over the fragment of conversation she had overheard, wondering what business required a stranger's visit in the dead of night, and what exactly Nathaniel could not afford to wait forever for. The next morning, Eleanor rose early and made her way to the stables before the rest of the household had stirred, hoping to learn something from the grooms about the stranger's carriage. She found a young stable hand named Peter brushing down a horse she did not recognize, its coat dark and unfamiliar among the household's usual stock. "Whose horse is this?" she asked, keeping her tone light and unbothered. Peter glanced up, clearly unused to the new Duchess seeking him out directly. "Belongs to a gentleman who came late last night, my lady. Left before sunrise this morning, in a hurry too. Didn't even wait for us to properly feed and water the animal." "Did he give a name?" "No, my lady. Paid well to keep the visit quiet, if you understand my meaning." Peter's cheeks colored slightly, as though he had said more than he intended. Mr. Croft met him at the side gate himself. "Wasn't my place to ask questions." Eleanor thanked him and walked back toward the house slowly, turning the information over in her mind. A visitor who paid for silence, met privately at a side gate rather than the main entrance, gone before the household could see his face clearly. Whatever business Nathaniel conducted in the dead of night, he had gone to considerable trouble to keep it hidden from everyone, including, it seemed, his own cousin. She considered telling Gareth immediately, but hesitated at the top of the stairs, weighing the wisdom of confronting Nathaniel's secrets with only a fragment of overheard conversation and a stable hand's vague account to support her. Gareth had made clear his distrust of Nathaniel already. What he needed was proof, not more suspicion built on shadows and half-heard words. She resolved to watch more carefully, to gather what evidence she could, before bringing her concerns to him, though the decision left her feeling exposed, as though she had chosen to walk further into danger, rather than away from it. Over breakfast, Nathaniel was as charming as ever, complimenting the eggs, asking after Eleanor's plans for the day, showing no sign that anything unusual had occurred the night before. Gareth remained largely silent, responding to his cousin's conversation with the same careful, guarded politeness Eleanor had come to recognize as his default defense. She watched the two men across the table, searching for some crack in either of their composures, but found none. Whatever truths lay buried beneath this house, both men had grown remarkably skilled at hiding them. It was Margaret, later that afternoon, who offered the next small piece of the puzzle, though she did not seem to realize the significance of what she shared. Eleanor found her folding linens again in the small sitting room and asked, as casually as she could manage, whether the household had noticed anything unusual about Mr. Croft's finances during his visit. Margaret's expression grew troubled. "It is strange you should ask, my lady. Cook mentioned only yesterday that Mr. Croft asked to borrow against his room and board here, said his own funds were tied up in some business venture that had not yet paid out. His Grace agreed, of course, family being family, but Cook thought it odd, a man of his standing needing to borrow for something so small." "How long has he been asking for such things?" "Since he arrived, my lady. Little requests here and there, a loan against future rents, an advance on some inheritance he says is still working its way through the courts." Margaret shook her head slightly. "It is not really my place to comment on such matters, but it did strike me as strange, given how grand he always appears." Eleanor thanked her and walked away with yet another thread added to the tangle she was slowly working to untangle. A man who dressed as though wealth came easily to him, yet borrowed small sums under various excuses. A late-night visitor paid to keep his presence secret. A fragment of urgent conversation about something that could not wait forever. None of it, on its own, proved anything. But together, the pieces were beginning to form a shape Eleanor did not like at all. A shape that suggested Nathaniel Croft was a man in considerably more trouble than his easy smile ever let on, and perhaps a man willing to go to considerable lengths to solve that trouble, whatever it might be. A week after the stranger's midnight visit, Eleanor found an old letter tucked inside a book of poetry in the library, one she suspected had once belonged to Charlotte, given the delicate initials pressed into the leather cover. She had not been searching for anything in particular, only passing the hours while Gareth attended to business in the county. But the letter fell loose from between the pages when she lifted the book from the shelf, and something about the handwriting made her pause before she had even finished reading the first line. The letter was addressed to Charlotte, written in Nathaniel's hand. Though the tone bore little resemblance to the polished charm he showed the household now, it spoke of debts he owed to men Eleanor did not recognize, of a plan that depended on Charlotte's continued generosity, of an arrangement he begged her to keep secret from her husband a little longer, until certain matters could be settled. The date at the top placed it only weeks before Charlotte's death. Eleanor read it 3 times, her hands growing colder with each pass. The handwriting grew more hurried toward the bottom of the page, the ink smudged in places as though it had been written quickly and sealed before its author could reconsider the words. There was a desperation in it that did not match the composed, confident man she had come to know over the past 2 weeks, a desperation that made her wonder just how deep his troubles had run even then, years before he arrived at Ashcombe Hall with his easy smile and his practiced charm. She sat with the letter for a long while, turning it over in her hands, imagining Charlotte reading these same words in this same library, perhaps sitting in this very chair, weighing loyalty to family against the quiet unease such a request must have stirred in her. Whatever Charlotte had ultimately decided, the outcome had not been kind to her, and Eleanor felt a fresh chill settle over her at the thought that she might now be standing exactly where the first Duchess had once stood, facing the same charming, dangerous man, with only her own judgment to guide her. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her dress. Whatever arrangement Nathaniel had built with Charlotte, it had clearly involved money moving quietly between them, exactly as Gareth had described, and exactly as Margaret's small observations about his current borrowing seemed to confirm. The pattern was repeating itself, and Eleanor now stood far closer to the center of it than she had realized. She found Gareth in the stables that evening, checking on a mare that had gone lame earlier in the week, and waited until the groom had stepped away before approaching him with the letter. "I found this in the library," she said quietly, handing it to him. "I believe it belonged to Charlotte." Gareth read it in silence, his jaw tightening with every line, and when he finished, his hands were not entirely steady as he folded the paper again. "This confirms what I always suspected but could never prove," he said, his voice low and strained. "He was bleeding money from her for months before she died. I do not know for what purpose, but I intend to find out." "There is more," Eleanor said, and told him what Margaret had shared about Nathaniel's borrowing, about the stranger who had come and gone in the dead of night, about the fragment of urgent conversation she had overheard through the study door. Gareth listened with a growing stillness that frightened her more than any outburst of anger could have, his eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance as the pieces assembled themselves in his mind. "He is in debt again," Gareth said finally. "Deeply, I would guess, if he is borrowing from the household under false pretenses and meeting strangers in secret to keep it hidden. And if history repeats itself, he will look for the same solution he found with Charlotte, which was a vulnerable woman with access to money and a husband, too grieved or too distracted to notice what was happening beneath his own roof." Gareth's voice hardened. "I will not allow that to happen to you, Eleanor. I should have sent him away the moment he arrived." "You said turning him away would only make things worse," Eleanor reminded him. "Perhaps there is another way. If he believes I am someone he can influence, someone naive enough to be drawn into whatever scheme he is building, we might learn exactly what he intends before he does any real damage." Gareth studied her for a long moment, something like admiration mixing with clear reluctance in his expression. "You would put yourself at risk deliberately, knowing what he may be capable of?" "I would rather face the danger with my eyes open than wait blindly for it to find me," Eleanor said. "You have spent 3 years unable to prove what happened to Charlotte. I do not intend to let him walk away this time with whatever he is planning still hidden." It was, she knew even as she said it, a reckless plan, built more on determination than caution. But something had shifted in her since she had first opened that box on her wedding night, since she had begun to understand the quiet decency buried beneath her husband's guarded exterior, since she had watched Nathaniel's charm curdle into something colder the moment he believed no one was watching. She was no longer simply the frightened girl who had walked down the aisle 2 weeks ago. She had a stake in this house now, and in the man who lived within it, and she found she was not willing to stand aside while his cousin threatened to repeat whatever tragedy had already claimed one woman who lived beneath this roof. Over the following days, Eleanor allowed herself to grow closer to Nathaniel, accepting his invitations to walk the gardens, listening with practiced sympathy as he spun stories about Gareth's coldness and his own supposed concern for her well-being. It was uncomfortable work, smiling at a man she now suspected of far worse than simple charm, but she found she could bear it if she reminded herself of the letter folded away in her writing desk, proof of exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. "You seem different lately," Nathaniel observed one afternoon, studying her with those same sharp eyes she had noticed the very first day. More at ease with me. I confess I am glad of it. I worried you might have believed Gareth's version of things too completely. I have simply come to see that people are rarely as simple as they first appear, Eleanor said carefully, letting just enough warmth into her voice to keep his interest without giving too much away. You have been kind to me, Nathaniel, whatever Gareth's suspicions. Something pleased flickered across his face, and Eleanor felt a small, cold satisfaction at having found the crack in his composure so quickly. Vanity, it seemed, was among his weaknesses. I hope you know you can trust me, he said, leaning slightly closer. If there is ever anything you need, anything at all, you need only ask. Actually, Eleanor said, choosing her words with great care, there is something. A small matter. Nothing serious, but I would rather not trouble Gareth with it. A debt of my own, from before the marriage, that I have been too embarrassed to mention. She watched interest sharpen behind his eyes at the mention of debt, exactly as she had hoped it would. How much are we discussing? She named a modest sum, small enough to seem believable, large enough to test whether he would offer to help despite his own apparent financial troubles. Nathaniel did not hesitate. Consider it handled, he said smoothly. I have some funds arriving shortly. I would be glad to assist, so long as it remains between us. Eleanor thanked him with practiced gratitude, though inside she felt only a deepening unease. A man claiming poverty to the household, borrowing against his own room and board, was somehow prepared to produce funds for her within days. It confirmed what she had begun to suspect since finding the letter in the library. Whatever scheme Nathaniel was building, it depended on exactly this kind of quiet trust, offered and accepted in secret, away from Gareth's watchful eyes. That night, she relayed the conversation to Gareth in the privacy of his study, and watched his expression darken further with every detail. He is establishing the same pattern, Gareth said grimly. Small kindnesses first, building trust, before whatever comes next. We need to know where his funds are truly coming from, and what he intends to ask of you once that trust is fully secured. Then we need proof, Eleanor said. Something more solid than a letter written years ago, and a pattern of behavior we can only guess at. Gareth was quiet for a long moment, turning something over in his mind. There is a way, he said finally. Risky, and it would require patience from both of us. But if we are careful, Nathaniel may hand us exactly the proof we need, without ever realizing he has done so. Eleanor leaned forward, her earlier fear giving way to something sharper, something almost eager. Tell me what you are thinking. If he believes you are willing to lend him credibility, or even funds of your own, he may grow bold enough to reveal more than he intends, Gareth said. Men like Nathaniel do not simply stop once they find a willing source of trust. They grow greedier. If we let him believe you are exactly the naive, sympathetic ally he hopes you are, he will eventually ask for something larger than a small personal debt. When he does, we will be ready to see exactly what he is planning, and who else may be involved. You mean the stranger from the side gate? Precisely. Whoever that man was, he did not travel through the night and pay for silence over a matter of small consequence. If Nathaniel is desperate enough to borrow from his own family under false pretenses, then whatever debt he owes elsewhere is considerable, and considerable debts make men reckless. Gareth's expression grew troubled as he spoke, the old grief for Charlotte plainly mixing with a fresh, sharper fear for Eleanor's safety. I do not like asking this of you. If I could find another way to expose him without placing you anywhere near his schemes, I would take it without hesitation. But there is no other way, Eleanor said, not one that would give us real proof at least. I would rather take the risk now, with you watching closely beside me, than wait for him to choose his moment without any warning at all. Gareth studied her for a long moment, and something in his gaze softened into an expression Eleanor had not seen from him before, something closer to genuine warmth than the careful courtesy he usually offered her. You are braver than I expected when I agreed to this marriage, he said quietly. I confess I did not think to find a partner in this house. I thought only to find a wife who would tolerate my company and ask for little in return. And now? Eleanor asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Now I find myself grateful for far more than I ever expected to receive from this arrangement, he said, and though he did not elaborate further, something passed between them in the quiet study that felt entirely separate from ledgers, debts, and dangerous cousins, something Eleanor did not yet have the words to name, but found she did not wish to look away from. They spent the remainder of the evening working out the careful details of their plan, deciding how much Eleanor should reveal to Nathaniel and when, agreeing that Gareth would quietly begin tracing whatever funds Nathaniel claimed were arriving soon, and settling on signals Eleanor could use if she ever felt she needed him nearby during her conversations with his cousin. It was well past midnight before they finished, and when Eleanor finally rose to retire to her chambers, Gareth walked her as far as the corridor, an unspoken courtesy that had not existed between them in the earliest days of their marriage. "Be careful with him," Gareth said quietly at her door. "Whatever charm he shows you, do not forget what he may be capable of." "I will not forget," Eleanor promised, and meant it completely, carrying both his warning and the memory of his unexpected warmth with her, long after the door had closed between them for the night. The bait took less than a week to work. Nathaniel found Eleanor in the garden again on a bright, cold morning, his manner more urgent than his usual practiced ease, and she knew immediately that whatever moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. "I need to ask something larger of you," he said, settling beside her on the bench without his customary charm softening the request first. "A more significant sum than before. I would not ask if the circumstances were not pressing." "How significant?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice carefully light despite the way her pulse had quickened. He named a figure large enough to make her breath catch, though she forced her expression to remain calm and sympathetic rather than alarmed. "I understand it is a great deal to ask," he continued quickly. "But I would repay you the moment my own funds arrive, with generous interest besides. I only need it to settle a matter that cannot wait any longer." "What sort of matter requires such urgency?" Nathaniel hesitated, and for the first time since his arrival, Eleanor saw genuine strain crack through his composure. "A debt I owe to men who do not extend patience easily," he admitted. "I had hoped to resolve it quietly, without troubling anyone in this house, but my own resources have proven insufficient." "The stranger who visited in the night," Eleanor said, watching his face carefully. "Was that connected to this debt?" His eyes sharpened instantly, suspicion flickering behind the desperation. "You know of that?" "The staff talk," Eleanor said with a practiced shrug, keeping her tone easy. "I did not think much of it until now." "Nathaniel, if you are in genuine danger, perhaps Gareth should know. He may be able to help in ways I cannot." "No." The word came sharper and faster than anything else he had said, and he caught himself immediately, softening his tone again. "No, please. Gareth would not understand. He has never forgiven me for things that were never truly my fault, and involving him would only make matters worse. I am asking you because I believe you see me more clearly than he does." Eleanor allowed a carefully measured silence to stretch between them, long enough to seem like genuine consideration. "I do not have access to that much money on my own," she said finally, "not without explaining myself to Gareth. But there is the estate he gave me, Thornfield. I could perhaps arrange something against its value, if you can assure me this will truly resolve your troubles." Something in Nathaniel's expression shifted at the mention of Thornfield, a flicker of calculation so quick Eleanor nearly missed it, and she understood in that instant that she had offered him something far more valuable than simple coin, an opening into property and holdings entirely separate from Gareth's control and oversight. "That would resolve everything," he said, his relief seeming almost genuine, layered thin over something colder underneath. "You would have my deepest gratitude, Eleanor. I would not forget such a kindness." "I will need a few days to arrange the details," she said. "And I would ask in return that you tell me plainly what this debt involves. I would rather understand fully what I am agreeing to help with." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, weighing, perhaps, how much of the truth he could afford to share, without frightening her away from her offer. "There were investments," he said finally, choosing his words with obvious care. "Ventures that did not perform as promised. I borrowed heavily to cover the losses, from men who expect repayment on their own terms rather than mine. It is nothing you need trouble yourself over beyond the sum itself." It was, Eleanor suspected, a version of the truth rather than the whole of it, but it was enough, combined with everything else they had already gathered, to bring to Gareth that evening. She relayed the entire conversation to him in the study, watching his expression grow grimmer with every detail, particularly the mention of Thornfield. "He is after the estate itself," Gareth said, pacing now, something he rarely did in her presence, "not simply the funds. If he can establish a claim against Thornfield through you, separate from my holdings, it becomes far harder for me to intervene, harder to protect what is legally yours." "Then we do not let him have it," Eleanor said. "We give him just enough rope to hang himself. I will tell him the arrangement is agreed, that papers are being drawn up, and we let him reveal the men behind this debt of his when he moves to finalize things. That is when we will have him." Gareth stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something that mixed pride with fear in equal measure. "You understand the risk in this. If he believes for even a moment that you are working against him rather than for him, There is no telling what he might do. I understand, Eleanor said steadily. But I would rather face that risk now, with a plan and with you beside me, than let him walk away to try this same scheme on some other unsuspecting woman in another house, the way he apparently tried with Charlotte. Gareth's jaw tightened at the mention of his first wife, but he did not argue further, and together they spent the following days preparing carefully. Gareth quietly engaged a solicitor he trusted completely, a man who had served the family for decades and who agreed to draft papers that appeared entirely legitimate while secretly containing safeguards that would protect Thornfield from any real transfer. Eleanor continued her careful performance with Nathaniel, expressing enthusiasm for helping him while subtly encouraging him to reveal more about the men he owed and the arrangement he hoped to strike. The solicitor, a careful and thorough man named Edmund Farrow who had served the Ashcombe family for over 20 years, returned to the estate on the third day with news that confirmed their worst suspicions. He had traced portions of Nathaniel's debts to a group of merchants and moneylenders operating out of the eastern ports, men known for extending credit at ruinous rates to gentlemen too proud or too desperate to seek help through more respectable channels. The sums involved were far larger than Nathaniel had admitted even in his most urgent moment with Eleanor, debts that had clearly been accumulating for years rather than months. "There is more, Your Grace," Farrow said, laying a second set of documents before Gareth in the study. Records suggesting Mr. Croft attempted a similar arrangement with another family in the neighboring county, less than a year past, a young widow, recently inherited, persuaded to lend against her late husband's property, before the scheme was discovered and quietly ended. No charges were brought. It seems the family preferred to avoid the scandal, but the pattern is unmistakable. Gareth's expression darkened further with every word. How many others, I wonder, before Charlotte and after her? "I could not say with certainty, Your Grace, but I would not be surprised if further inquiry revealed more. Men who prey upon trust rarely stop after a single success, and rarely stop after a single failure either." Farrow gathered his papers carefully. "I have prepared everything needed to expose the falseness of his claims against Thornfield, and I have taken the liberty of alerting a contact within the local magistracy. Given the severity of what we have uncovered, I await only your instruction on when to proceed." Eleanor, who had been listening quietly from near the window, felt a fresh wave of anger at the thought of some other widow, somewhere in the neighboring county, who had nearly suffered the same fate she had so narrowly avoided. It strengthened her resolve considerably, any lingering hesitation about the risk she was taking dissolving into a hard, clear determination to see the scheme exposed fully, not only for her own sake and Gareth's, but for whoever might have come after them, had Nathaniel been allowed to continue unchecked. "Proceed," Gareth said to Farrow. "As soon as everything is properly prepared, I want no possibility left for him to claim innocence or misunderstanding when this is finished." The plan nearly unraveled on the fourth day, when Nathaniel arrived at Eleanor's chambers unannounced, his usual charm entirely absent, replaced by a raw urgency that frightened her more than anything he had shown before. "They are growing impatient," he said without preamble, closing the door behind him before Eleanor could object to the impropriety. "I need the papers finalized sooner than we discussed. Tomorrow, if possible." "Tomorrow is too soon," Eleanor said, trying to keep the alarm from her voice. "The solicitor needs time to prepare everything properly. Then find a way to make more time, or find another way to give me what I need." His voice had lost every trace of its earlier warmth, and for the first time, Eleanor saw clearly the desperate, dangerous man hiding beneath the charming cousin he had presented to the household since his arrival. "I did not come to this house to be delayed by paperwork, Eleanor. I came because I believed you understood the urgency of my situation." "I do understand," she said carefully, forcing herself to remain calm despite the fear tightening in her chest. "But rushing risks mistakes that could expose both of us, Nathaniel. Surely a single additional day changes nothing for men who have already waited this long." Something in her steady tone seemed to reach him, and after a long, tense moment, the desperation in his expression receded slightly, replaced by something more controlled, though no less unsettling. "One more day," he said finally, "no longer than that." He left as abruptly as he had arrived, and Eleanor sank onto the edge of her bed the moment the door closed, her hands trembling with the effort of maintaining her composure throughout the exchange. She found Gareth within minutes, relaying everything that had happened, and watched his face darken with a fury she had not seen from him before. "He came to your chambers, alone, and threatened you," Gareth said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This ends now, Eleanor. I will not risk your safety a moment longer for the sake of gathering more proof." "We have enough," Eleanor agreed, her earlier fear giving way to something steadier now that she was no longer facing Nathaniel alone. The letter from Charlotte, the pattern of borrowing, his own words tonight about men who expect repayment on their terms, combined with whatever the solicitor uncovers about these mysterious creditors of his, it should be sufficient to expose him properly, publicly, in a way that leaves him nowhere left to hide. That night, Gareth sent an urgent message to the solicitor, along with a second letter to a contact he trusted within the local magistracy, setting in motion the final piece of their plan. When Nathaniel returned the following afternoon expecting finalized papers and Eleanor's cooperation, he found instead a room full of witnesses waiting for him in the drawing room, the solicitor holding documents that revealed the true nature of his debts, and a magistrate's representative prepared to ask exactly the kind of questions Nathaniel had spent years avoiding. The color drained from his face the moment he understood what awaited him, his easy charm crumbling entirely for the first time since his arrival at Ashcombe Hall. He looked to Eleanor with something between betrayal and fury, and she met his gaze without flinching, no longer the frightened bride who had first watched him step down from his carriage 2 weeks earlier. "You," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You planned this from the start. You taught me everything I needed to know about deception," Eleanor said calmly. "I simply learned the lesson faster than you expected." The solicitor stepped forward then, laying out the documents he had gathered over the previous days across the drawing room table. "Mr. Croft," he said formally, "we have obtained records showing considerable debts owed to a group of men operating out of the eastern ports, debts secured against promises you had no legal right to make, including a false claim against property belonging to the Ashcombe estate itself. We have also obtained a copy of correspondence between yourself and the late Duchess, correspondence that raises serious questions about the nature of funds that passed between you in the months before her death." Nathaniel's composure, so carefully maintained through every prior conversation, finally shattered completely. "That proves nothing," he said, though his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "Charlotte gave that money freely. I never forced her hand." "Did you tell her the same urgent stories you told me?" Eleanor asked quietly. "The same talk of men who could not wait, of ruin that could only be avoided with her help. Did she believe you as I nearly did, before I found the courage to look more closely at the man behind the charm?" Nathaniel said nothing, his jaw working silently as the magistrate's representative stepped forward to explain, in measured official language, exactly what consequences awaited a man who had attempted to fraudulently secure property through false representations and coercion, and who now stood suspected of far graver conduct connected to the death of a duchess 3 years prior. The room grew very quiet as the weight of those words settled over everyone present. Gareth, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally stepped forward to stand beside Eleanor, his presence steady and unyielding. "You will leave this house today," he said to his cousin, his voice carrying none of the guarded coldness Eleanor had grown used to in their earliest days together, replaced instead by a hard, controlled authority. "Whatever the courts decide regarding your debts and your conduct toward Charlotte, you will never again set foot on Ashcombe land, nor approach any member of this household. I should have done this 3 years ago, when my suspicions first took root. I will not make that mistake twice." Nathaniel looked between his cousin and Eleanor, something desperate and cornered flashing across his face before he mastered himself enough to speak. "You will regret this," he said, though the threat rang hollow against the reality of the documents spread across the table before him. "Both of you." "Perhaps," Gareth said evenly, "but I regret far more deeply the years I spent doubting my own judgment, because I could not prove what I always suspected. That regret ends today." The magistrate's men escorted Nathaniel from the house within the hour, his belongings gathered hastily under close supervision, to ensure nothing of value left with him that did not rightfully belong to him. Eleanor watched from the same window where she had once watched him arrive with such easy confidence, and felt something loosen in her chest as his carriage finally rolled away down the long drive, this time for good. Gareth found her still standing there some time later, the house settling into an unfamiliar quiet now that the tension of the past weeks had finally broken. "You were remarkable today," he said, coming to stand beside her at the window, "braver than I had any right to ask of you." "I did not do it alone," Eleanor said, turning to look at him properly. "I do not think I could have managed any of it without knowing you stood behind me." Something passed between them then, quiet and unspoken, a recognition of everything they had built together in the short weeks since their wedding day, forged not through romance or courtship but through danger faced side by side, and Eleanor found, studying the tired relief in her husband's face, that she no longer thought of him as the stranger she had married out of necessity, but as something else entirely, something she was only just beginning to find the words for. The weeks following Nathaniel's departure brought a quiet Eleanor, had not thought Ashcombe Hall capable of holding, a peace that settled over the house like sunlight breaking through clouds that had lingered far too long. The magistrate's investigation moved forward steadily, and within a month, word reached the estate that Nathaniel had been formally charged, not only with attempting to defraud Eleanor through false claims against Thornfield, but with a broader pattern of deception that stretched back years, implicating him in financial schemes across 3 counties. The widow Farrow had mentioned came forward once she learned she was not alone in having been targeted, and her testimony, combined with the documents Farrow had gathered, painted a picture of a man who had spent the better part of a decade preying on trusting relatives and vulnerable women alike. The question of Charlotte's death remained more difficult to resolve with certainty. The physicians who examined the old records could not say definitively whether Nathaniel's financial demands had directly hastened her illness, or whether the wasting sickness that took her would have claimed her regardless of the strain he placed upon her in those final months. But the magistrate agreed there was sufficient concern to reopen a formal inquiry, and Gareth, though he knew the answers might never fully satisfy him, found something like peace in simply having the truth pursued openly at last, rather than buried beneath years of quiet suspicion he had never been able to prove. "I do not know if we will ever have certainty about what happened to her," he told Eleanor one evening, the two of them seated together in the study that had become, over the preceding weeks, less a place of guarded secrets and more a place where they spoke honestly with one another. "But I find I no longer need certainty the way I once believed I did. Knowing the truth about his character, knowing he will never again have the chance to harm anyone else the way he harmed Charlotte, or nearly harmed you, that is enough." "It is more than enough," Eleanor said gently. "You spent 3 years carrying suspicion no one else believed. That burden alone must have been exhausting." "It was," Gareth admitted. "I stopped trusting my own judgment for a long while after Charlotte died, wondering if I had imagined connections that were never truly there, wondering if grief had simply made me suspicious of an innocent man. You gave me back my certainty, Eleanor, in ways I am not sure I can ever properly thank you for." Eleanor felt warmth rise in her chest at his words, warmth that had been building steadily in the weeks since Nathaniel's exposure, though neither of them had yet spoken plainly about what exactly had grown between them during that dangerous, uncertain time. She had come to this marriage as a stranger, forced into an arrangement neither of them had chosen freely, and yet somewhere in the process of facing danger together, of learning to trust each other's judgment and courage, something entirely unplanned had taken root. "May I ask you something?" she said, setting aside the book she had been pretending to read. "That first night, when you gave me the deed to Thornfield, why did you truly do it? I do not think it was only about protecting me from potential ruin, as you claimed then." Gareth was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she had come to recognize as his careful, considering look, the one he wore whenever he weighed how much honesty a moment deserved. "I think," he said finally, "that after Charlotte, I had convinced myself I would never again allow anyone close enough to matter. That distance was the safest way to live with what I had lost and what I could never prove. But something in your face on our wedding day, the fear you tried so hard to hide, the quiet dignity with which you faced a situation you had never chosen, reminded me that not everyone who enters this house does so with schemes and hidden motives. I wanted you to know from the very first night that whatever this marriage became, you would never be trapped the way I feared you might be. I did not expect, when I made that decision, that it would lead to anything more than a fair arrangement between 2 people bound by circumstance." "And now?" Eleanor asked, echoing the same question she had once asked him weeks earlier in this very room. "Now," Gareth said, rising from his chair and crossing to where she sat, "I find that fair arrangement has become something I value far beyond anything written into our marriage contract. You did not simply survive what Nathaniel brought into this house, Eleanor. You faced it directly, with more courage than I have shown in 3 years of quiet suspicion, and in doing so, you gave me back a piece of myself I thought I had lost entirely." He knelt beside her chair, taking her hand in his, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the unfamiliar tenderness in a gesture so different from the cold, formal ceremony that had bound them together weeks earlier. "I know this marriage began as a bargain neither of us chose," he continued. "But I find myself hoping, Eleanor, that it might become something neither of us regrets, not out of obligation, and not out of the debt my proposal once erased for your family, but because I have come to care for you more deeply than I believed myself still capable of caring for anyone." Eleanor felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes, though they carried none of the grief and fear that had accompanied her down the aisle on her wedding day. "I did not expect to find anything like happiness in this marriage," she admitted quietly. "I expected only to endure it, the way one endures a difficult season, waiting for it to pass. But somewhere in these past weeks, watching you protect this household, Watching you fight for the truth about Charlotte, even when it cost you comfort and certainty, I found I no longer wished for this season to pass at all. Then perhaps, Gareth said softly, we might choose to build something together, rather than simply endure what circumstance handed us. Eleanor's parents arrived at Ashcombe Hall 2 weeks after Nathaniel's departure, summoned by a letter Gareth had sent explaining, in careful and measured terms, everything that had occurred. Her father entered the drawing room with none of the shame he had carried on the wedding day, replaced instead by a nervous hope that softened into open relief the moment he saw his daughter looking well, steady, and unmistakably at ease within the walls of her new home. I feared I had sold you into misery, he admitted quietly, once Gareth had excused himself to allow father and daughter a private moment. I told myself it was the only way to save what remained of our family, but I never stopped fearing what it might cost you. It cost me nothing I was not willing to give in the end, Eleanor said, taking her father's hands in hers. And it gave me far more than either of us could have imagined that day. I do not hold the arrangement against you, father. I have come to understand that even difficult beginnings can lead somewhere worth arriving at. Her mother wept openly upon hearing the full account of Nathaniel's scheme and Eleanor's role in exposing it, alternating between horror at the danger her daughter had faced and fierce pride at the courage she had shown in facing it. You were always braver than you gave yourself credit for, her mother said, holding Eleanor's face gently in both hands. I only wish I had told you so more often, before circumstance forced you to prove it under such frightening conditions. The visit lasted a full week, filled with quiet conversations that mended what fear and shame had strained on the wedding day, and by the time her parents departed, Eleanor felt a lightness in her chest that had been missing since long before her marriage had even been arranged, the sense of a family made whole again, not through wealth or obligation, but through honesty finally spoken aloud. The trial itself, when it finally convened some months later in the county courthouse, drew a curious crowd eager to witness the fall of a man who had once moved so easily through society's finer circles. Eleanor testified with a steadiness that surprised even herself, recounting the garden conversations, the borrowed sums, the desperate visit to her chambers, and the documents Pharaoh had gathered, her voice never wavering even as Nathaniel glared at her from across the courtroom, with open hatred replacing whatever charm he had once managed to summon. The widow from the neighboring county testified as well, her account eerily similar to Eleanor's own experience, confirming beyond doubt the deliberate, practiced nature of Nathaniel's schemes. By the time the final witness had spoken, even those in the gallery who had once counted Nathaniel among their acquaintances no longer doubted the truth of what he had built his charming reputation upon. The judge's sentence was severe, reflecting both the financial damage Nathaniel had caused across 3 counties and the gravity of the suspicions surrounding Charlotte's final months, suspicions the court found credible enough to weigh heavily against him even without absolute proof. He was led from the courthouse in chains, his easy smile finally and permanently extinguished, and Eleanor felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet relief that he would never again have the opportunity to charm his way into another vulnerable household. In the months that followed, Ashcombe Hall transformed in ways the staff had not witnessed since long before Charlotte's death. Margaret, who had watched the new Duchess with cautious hope since her first confused evening exploring the manor's corridors, found herself smiling more freely as laughter began to fill rooms that had stood silent and formal for years. The secret kindnesses Gareth had always practiced quietly among the tenant families became less secret, as Eleanor joined him in visiting the village, learning names and needs, extending the quiet generosity he had once hidden even from his own wife into something they now shared openly together. Margaret, who had watched the new Duchess with cautious hope since her first confused evening exploring the manor's corridors, found herself smiling more freely as laughter began to fill rooms that had stood silent and formal for years. One evening, gathering courage over tea in the small sitting room where their earliest conversations about the household secrets had taken place, Margaret confessed something she had held back for weeks. I worried for you, my lady, the day Mr. Croft arrived, she admitted. I saw the way he watched you, the same way he once watched Lady Charlotte, and I feared I was witnessing history repeat itself with no way to stop it. I am ashamed to say, I did not have the courage to speak more plainly of my fears. You gave me what you could, Margaret, Eleanor said gently. The gallery, the portrait, the small truths you were willing to share despite your loyalty to this household's silence. It was enough to make me watch more carefully than I otherwise might have. I do not fault you for the caution loyalty required of you. Margaret's eyes grew bright with unshed tears at the kindness in Eleanor's words, and from that evening forward something eased between them, A friendship built on shared history, rather than simply the formal distance of mistress and housekeeper. The village, too, felt the change that had settled over Ashcombe Hall. Where Gareth had once visited the tenant families alone and quietly, always careful to keep his generosity hidden from wider notice, he and Eleanor now walked the lanes together on market days, learning the names of children who had grown considerably since the last time anyone from the manor had paused to notice them. An elderly widow named Agnes, whose roof Gareth had quietly repaired 2 winters earlier, wept with open gratitude when Eleanor visited to check on her well-being personally, insisting on staying long enough to share tea and hear stories of the county's history that no history book would ever record. "Your husband has always had a good heart, my lady," Agnes told her, pressing Eleanor's hand warmly between her own weathered palms. "He simply never believed anyone would think well of him for it, not after everything that happened with the first Duchess. It does my old heart good to see him unafraid to let it show at last." Eleanor carried those words home with her, turning them over as she watched Gareth from across their evening table. No longer the guarded, distant man who had signed a marriage register with barely a glance in her direction, but someone entirely transformed by the simple, steady work of being known and trusted rather than merely feared or doubted. Thornfield remained Eleanor's own, exactly as promised, though she found she rarely needed to retreat there for safety or independence, the way the original gift had once implied she might. Instead, she and Gareth visited it together on occasion, walking the grounds his mother had once loved so dearly, and Eleanor came to understand that the deed had never truly been about providing an escape from her marriage, but about ensuring she always had the freedom to choose her own path. Freedom that, in the end, led her not away from Ashcombe Hall, but more fully into the life she had built there. Nathaniel's trial concluded with a conviction that satisfied even Pharaoh's careful, measured expectations, and though the full truth of Charlotte's final months would never be known with complete certainty, the household found a measure of peace in knowing that whatever role he had played in her suffering, he would never again have the opportunity to harm anyone else who trusted him. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Gareth surprised Eleanor with a second gift, smaller than the first but no less meaningful. A simple ring set with a stone the same warm brown as the eyes in Charlotte's portrait, chosen not to replace the past but to honor it, while looking forward to whatever future they intended to build together. "I did not think, on our wedding day, that I would ever look back on that morning with anything but sorrow," Eleanor told him, turning the ring gently in the evening light. "But now, I find I am grateful for every part of it, even the fear, even the uncertainty, because it led me here, to you, and to a life I could never have imagined choosing for myself, yet would not now trade for any other." Gareth smiled, the real, unguarded smile that had become far more familiar over the past year than the cold formality she had first encountered at their wedding altar. "Neither would I, Eleanor," he said, drawing her close. "Neither would I." Outside the windows of Ashcombe Hall, the gardens bloomed fuller than they had in years, tended now with the same quiet care that had once been reserved only for secret ledgers and hidden kindnesses, but now belonged openly to a household that had learned, through danger and doubt, exactly what it meant to build trust from nothing but honesty, courage, and the willingness to fight for one another when it mattered most. 2 years after Nathaniel Croft was led away in chains, Ashcombe Hall welcomed a new voice into its halls, one that carried none of the weight or history the manor had known before, only the bright, demanding cries of a newborn daughter. Eleanor held the child close in the same chambers where she had once sat trembling on her wedding night, staring at an unopened box and wondering what kind of life awaited her within these walls. The room looked entirely different now, warmed by years of laughter and honest conversation, filled with small evidence of a marriage that had grown into something neither she nor Gareth had dared to hope for on that cold, formal wedding day. "She has your eyes," Gareth said softly, sitting beside the bed and studying their daughter with an expression of wonder Eleanor had rarely seen cross his face, even in their happiest moments together. "And I suspect, given how loudly she announced her arrival, she may have inherited your stubbornness as well." "I prefer to call it determination," Eleanor said, smiling despite her exhaustion. "It served me well enough, when it mattered most." They named her Charlotte, a decision Eleanor had suggested gently one evening months earlier, watching Gareth's face carefully for any sign that the name might carry too much old grief to bear comfortably. Instead, something had eased in his expression, a quiet gratitude that the first Duchess's memory might live on not as a shadow of suspicion and loss, but as a name spoken with love, in a household finally free of the doubt that had haunted it for so long. "I think she would have liked that," Gareth had said then, and Eleanor had felt certain, watching him now with their daughter cradled gently in his arms, that he believed it completely. The years that followed brought their own quiet challenges, as every life does, but none carried the shadow of hidden schemes or guarded secrets that had once defined the earliest days of their marriage. Margaret remained at the house long enough to see young Charlotte take her first unsteady steps across the nursery floor, and retired at last to a comfortable cottage on the estate grounds that Gareth and Eleanor insisted on providing, a small kindness in return for the loyalty and quiet courage she had shown during the most dangerous weeks of Eleanor's early marriage. Farrow, the careful solicitor who had helped expose Nathaniel's schemes, remained a trusted friend to the family long after the trial concluded, visiting several times a year to share news of the county, and, occasionally, updates on Nathaniel himself, who served his sentence with none of the charm that had once carried him so easily through polite society. Word eventually reached them that he had died in confinement some years later, and Eleanor felt, upon hearing the news, not satisfaction, but a quiet closing of a chapter she had long since stopped allowing to define her daily thoughts. Thornfield flourished under Eleanor's careful attention, becoming not merely a symbol of the freedom Gareth had once promised her, but a genuine second home where the family spent warm summer months away from the formality of Ashcombe Hall, walking the same gardens Gareth's mother had once loved so deeply. Eleanor often thought, standing among those flower beds with Charlotte chasing butterflies nearby and Gareth watching with quiet contentment from a garden bench, that the deed which had once seemed such a strange and unsettling wedding gift had become, in time, one of the truest expressions of love she had ever received, a promise of freedom offered before it was ever asked for, honored faithfully in every year that followed. When Charlotte turned 7, old enough to notice the portraits lining the gallery and ask questions about the faces staring down from those gilded frames, she paused one afternoon before the portrait of the first Duchess, tilting her small head curiously at the warm brown eyes so similar to her own. "Mama, who is that lady? Margaret says she has my name." Eleanor knelt beside her daughter, considering carefully how much of the truth a child of 7 could hold without fear taking root where only understanding was needed. "That is Lady Charlotte," she said gently. "She lived in this house many years ago, before your father and I were married. You were named for her, because she was kind, and because your father loved her very much, in the way people love family who have passed on. Did she go to heaven?" "She did," Eleanor said softly. "A long time ago now. But I think she would be very glad to know a little girl as bright and curious as you carries her name through these halls." Charlotte considered this with the serious solemnity only small children manage convincingly, then reached up to take her mother's hand. "I will be kind too then, like her." "I have no doubt of it," Eleanor said, smiling despite the small ache the conversation stirred, an old grief that had long since softened into something gentler, something closer to gratitude for a woman she had never met, but whose memory had shaped, in ways both painful and profound, the family Eleanor now called her own. She did not tell Charlotte, that day or for many years after, the fuller and darker truth of what had happened within these walls, the schemes and suspicions and dangerous nights that had once threatened to unravel everything before it had properly begun. That was a story for later, for a daughter old enough to understand not only the fear but the courage that had answered it, old enough to appreciate that her parents' love had been tested and proven, rather than simply assumed. For now, it was enough that Charlotte grew up surrounded by warmth, by parents who spoke honestly with one another and with her, by a household finally free of the secrets that had once filled its corridors with such careful, guarded silence. Eleanor's own parents visited often in those years, her father growing steadily more comfortable within the grand halls of Ashcombe Hall with each passing season, until the shame that had once colored every visit faded into something closer to simple, uncomplicated pride. He delighted in his granddaughter without restraint, carrying her on his shoulders through the gardens Eleanor had once wandered as a frightened new bride, and Eleanor found, watching them together, that the debt which had once forced her into an unwanted marriage had become, in time, nothing more than a distant memory, overshadowed entirely by everything good that had grown from that difficult beginning. On quiet evenings when the household had settled and young Charlotte slept soundly in the nursery, Eleanor and Gareth often sat together in the study that had once held so many careful secrets, now simply a place where they read side by side or spoke of ordinary matters, the estate's harvest, a letter from her parents, plans for Charlotte's education as she grew. It was, Eleanor reflected often, an ordinary happiness, unremarkable to anyone looking in from the outside, and yet it felt, to her, like the rarest treasure imaginable, earned through danger and doubt, and the slow, careful work of choosing to trust one another, when trust had once seemed impossible. "Do you ever think of that first night?" she asked him once, years into their marriage, watching firelight flicker across his face. Older now, but no less dear to her than it had become in those early, uncertain weeks. The box, the deed, the strange kindness of a man I believed to be little more than a cold stranger. Often, Gareth admitted, reaching for her hand across the small distance between their chairs. I think of how frightened you looked, and how determined you were not to show it. I think of how little I understood, that night, what kind of woman I had actually married. I gave you that deed believing I was offering an escape, should you ever need one. I never imagined I was offering the beginning of the truest happiness I have ever known. Eleanor squeezed his hand gently, the same warmth that had grown steadily between them since those first uncertain days settling comfortably over the room like the firelight itself. We were both strangers once, she said softly. Bound by circumstance neither of us chose. I am endlessly grateful we found our way past that beginning, into something neither of us could have imagined asking for, yet both of us needed all the same. Outside the study window, Ashcombe Hall's garden stretched into the darkening evening, tended now with the same care that had once been reserved for hidden ledgers and quiet acts of kindness, but which now belonged openly to a family built not on obligation or debt, but on courage, honesty, and a love that had grown slowly, steadily, from the most unlikely of beginnings into something neither time nor danger had ever managed to shake loose. And as the fire burned low and Charlotte's small footsteps could be heard padding softly down the corridor toward her parents' voices, Eleanor understood, more fully than she ever had before, that the fate she had once feared on her wedding day had led her, against every expectation, exactly where she was always meant to be. She thought sometimes of the girl who had stood trembling before her mirror on that first cold morning, certain that marriage to a stranger could only mean the end of every hope she had once carried for her own life. That girl could not have imagined this quiet evening, this steady warmth, this small, determined daughter now curling up between her parents' chairs to listen, half asleep, to the low murmur of their voices. She could not have imagined a husband who had proven, through danger and honesty both, that some bargains, however they begin, can grow into something neither party ever thought to ask for. Gareth caught her eye across the firelight, and though neither of them spoke, Eleanor understood the quiet question in his gaze, the same one he had asked her, in different words, so many times over the years since that first uncertain wedding night. She answered it now the way she always did, with a small, certain smile that needed no further words attached to it. A smile that said, plainly and completely, that whatever fate had first forced them together, she would not now choose any different path. Not for all the freedom in the world, because the life they had built together, hard won and carefully tended, had become the truest freedom she had ever known.